capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of Africa's mega cities where millions live, work and play. And this is Luanda, the capital of Angola. This is Congo. Now, these were all states that were created at the end of the 19th century during what became known as the Scramble for Africa. But these territories formed part of the historic Kingdom of Congo. In this episode, we find out about this ancient civilization and how old lineages were devastated by European colonizers, and also why Belgian rule of the Congo represents one of the most brutal chapters of African history in this era. River is the second longest in Africa after the Nile and is the deepest river in the world. It's been a vital part of life in Central Africa throughout the centuries. Today, drivers of cars and trucks pull up by the river for a quick wash of their vehicles, and people fish regularly, hoping to get a good catch. The river bears the name of one of the great kingdoms of Africa, which tragically was to fall victim to the ambitions of the Europeans. We meet a member of one royal family in Congo who's nearly 100. She recalls the cruelty of Belgian rule. Her great-niece is overcome by grief as she relates how her great-great-grandfather, King Msiri, was shot dead by a Belgian captain for refusing to hand over his land.
On a beaucoup d'émotions, comme vous le sentez, vous le voyez. C'est rare. Quand je viens ici, d'habitude, c'est toujours en larmes parce que partout où l'on passe, on nous rappelle. Excusez-moi. Excusez-moi.
And we see how the Kingdom of Congo is linked to two of the most important female figures in African history, Queen Nzinga and Kimpa First, let us turn to the origins of the Kingdom of Congo. This was founded in 1390. The people south of the river lived in the largest portion of the kingdom, covering parts of what are today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, and Angola. About 100 years later, some people began to move northwards and settled in what became the Republic of Congo and Gabon. Professor Isidore Nziem is a Congolese historian and contributor to UNESCO's General History of Africa volumes, on which the series bases its facts. I ask him to tell us what we know about the founder of the Congo Kingdom, called Lukeni Lua Nimi.
À partir d'une réalité, c'est que il avait la maîtrise du fer, du travail du fer. Et le royaume va se construire spécialement sur cette technologie, parce qu'on va estimer que quelqu'un qui maîtrise le travail du fer, c'est certainement un surhomme. Et donc c'est sur cette base-là. Et d'ailleurs le terme Mani Congo proviendra de là. Mani, c'est le seigneur, un Congo, c'est le fer, c'est le maître du fer. On dira le roi forgeron, quelquefois. Et il va commencer là, et il va réunir la population autour d'un pouvoir politique et qui va commencer. Et c'est comme ça qu'il devient le fondateur d'un tout autre royaume qui sera plus important, plus prestigieux que le petit royaume d'où il provenait.
Le grand royaume que devient le royaume Congo. Donc le mérite de Nimi Alukeni, c'est d'avoir réussi cette alchimie, cette union, créer une espèce de nation, donc un peuple, une terre, une langue. Le Congo devient un terme générique qui englobe un ensemble de peuples, un territoire et une langue et qui se fonde sur un mythe fondateur commun.
The Mani-Congo, or King Lukeni Luanima, established his capital at Mbanza, Congo, which is on the border of modern-day northern Angola and the DRC, and is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mbanza, Congo was densely populated, giving the Mani-Congo a ready supply of manpower. And there was a clear division of labor. Each regional group or clan had its own profession: pottery, weaving, basket making, and trade was based on a system of barter. Textiles, for instance, could be exchanged for other goods. Less than a century after the Congo Kingdom was established, Portuguese sailors arrived at the court of the Mani-Congo, Nzinga a Ukuwu, in 1483. The Mani-Congo and his son and heir were persuaded to become Christian. He took the name João I, and his son became known as Afonso. By the time Afonso became king in 1509, the seeds for European domination of this part of Africa had been sown. A year later, the Portuguese began what became known as the transatlantic slave trade. King Afonso I was opposed to this and wrote to the Portuguese king telling him,
Écoutez, vos gens qui sont ici ne respectent personne. Ils prennent comme esclaves même des gens de ma maison, donc les gens de ma famille. Il faut interdire cette activité parce que cette activité n'est pas conforme au christianisme.
Ils arrivent avec un discours d'amitié, de coopération. C'est après que les rois africains se rendent compte que derrière ce discours-là, il y avait des préoccupations économiques. C'est après qu'ils vont se rendre compte, notamment à partir de l'activité des missionnaires, que les missionnaires sont beaucoup plus intéressés à la traite négrière qu'à l'évangile.
Afonso tried to prevent people from being illegally enslaved, but in 1542 he died. But once a king died, there was usually some dispute over the succession, either between his brothers or the sons of the Mani-Congo. Sometimes these rivals would form competing factions for power, and the rivalry could last for a very, very long time. Over the following decades, the Kingdom of Congo was subsumed by power struggles, which weakened its control over its domain in some dependent kingdoms, such as Ndongo to the south, ruled by the Ngola people. And apart from internal rivalries, there were also the activities of the Portuguese, who were increasingly trading in slaves.
Bon, dans la mesure où le royaume du Congo ne va pas collaborer correctement à la traite négrière, l'intérêt des Portugais va davantage aller vers plus au sud, donc vers le royaume d'Angola.
The Portuguese wanted slaves from the kingdom of Ndongo, and by 1575 they had established a new slave trading colony at Luanda Bay in present-day Angola. They conquered coastal areas which could serve as slave trading hubs and launched slaving raids inland or relied on local rulers to sell them slaves.
Esta colaboração é uma forma de corrupção. Então, o povo, ou os grandes, digamos, que estavam dentro desse processo, os notáveis, as personalidades que tinham contato com os portugueses, que queriam tirar proveitos econômicos neste processo da venda de escravos. Então, é um facto, havia essa colaboração, mas foi uma forma de corromper, digamos, as comunidades locais ou as pessoas que queriam tirar algum proveito econômico neste processo.
But most communities were opposed to the slave trade, and this period of African history has given rise to one of the best-known queens of that era who resisted the Portuguese. She was Queen Nzinga of the Ndongo Kingdom. This is a towering statue of her in Luanda, the capital of Angola. In 1635, Nzinga formed powerful alliances and was in constant warfare with the Portuguese for about a quarter of a century. She was a deft diplomat, a skilled negotiator, and brilliant tactician. She managed to hone her skills during her long life. Professor Scholastique Nzinga takes up the story of Queen Nzinga.
La reine Nzinga est une des grandes figures féminines de l'histoire de l'Afrique. De son nom congolais, c'est Nzinga Mbandi, et elle sera baptisée dans la religion catholique sous le nom de Anna Nzinga. C'est une personnalité très forte dès son enfance. En tout cas, son père remarquait son intelligence, sa force de caractère, et tout au long de sa vie, elle va développer donc ses qualités.
Nzinga had been well trained by her father. In 1622, she went to Luanda, at first to try to negotiate with the Portuguese on the royal family's behalf. The Portuguese official was seated, and he expected Nzinga to sit on the floor on a rug. Affronted by this, she commanded one of her male attendants to go down on all fours, and she sat on him instead, as this 17th century etching illustrates.
Elle a gouverné pendant longtemps, oui. Et ce qui fait qu'elle restera longtemps au pouvoir, c'est parce qu'elle va emporter beaucoup de victoires. Bien sûr, il y aura des défaites aussi, mais c'est une guerrière. Elle va même en mettre en place un réseau de renseignements, aller prendre les informations, pouvoir vaincre ses adversaires. Donc elle met en place un service d'espionnage, donc de renseignement militaire. Et à l'époque, ce n'était pas facile parce qu'elle a en face quand même des gens qui militairement sont supérieurs. Mais cette femme donc va se battre, va affronter les Portugais, les troupes portugaises, et jusqu'au moment où le Portugal sera obligé de céder. Et donc on va lui proposer un traité de paix.
But the balance of power shifted over the years in favor of the Portuguese, and Nzinga died in 1663, unable to stop their ascendancy in the region. Soon after Nzinga's death, the Kingdom of Congo fell into the grip of civil war, with the Portuguese playing off one faction against the other. But then another great African woman rose to the fore and tried to restore the glory of Congo. Her name was Kimpavita. She was from a noble family and was regarded as a prophetess by her followers. She had her own Christian movement and was bitterly opposed to slavery. She led a revolt against the Portuguese in the early 1700s.
Kimpavita, c'est une femme qui va, elle aussi, marquer l'histoire du royaume de Congo. Kimpavita, elle s'impose au XVIIIe siècle dans l'histoire du Congo en tant que résistante à la domination portugaise. Elle va agir en tant que personne illuminée. Elle reçoit un message de Saint Antoine. Donc sa mission, c'est la restauration du royaume de Congo. Elle va, par exemple, impliquer tout le monde dans sa lutte, aux jeunes. Elle va demander aux femmes, aux vieux, à tout le monde de s'impliquer. Mais ce qui est important, c'est que cette femme a donné sa vie pour le salut du royaume, puisqu'elle sera brûlée vive.
Do you think that the role of women in history has been somewhat overlooked?
Donc, il faut qu'on révise les manuels d'histoire, qu'on accorde beaucoup de visibilité aux femmes dans les manuels d'histoire. Et ça, c'est le travail, je crois, de tout le monde. Les pouvoirs publics doivent prendre conscience qu'il faut que chaque citoyen se reconnaisse.
The heroic resistance of Kimpavita and her violent death in 1706 at the hands of her enemies have secured her place in the history books. But such efforts to save the Kingdom of Congo ultimately failed, and by 1880, most of it had been reduced to decentralized trading villages. This period ushered in a dramatically new and tragic chapter for the people of Congo. The kingdom's former territories became ruled by the Belgians in the Congo and the Portuguese in Angola. The Portuguese still transported Africans, especially Angolans, to Brazil and the Caribbean until the late 19th century, although the slave trade had been made illegal in the early 1800s. And Portuguese rule of Angola resulted in an economy based on various forms of slavery and forced labor right up until the mid-1900s.
O trabalho forçado era uma das formas como eles utilizaram para, digamos, em termos econômicos, produzir mais riqueza. A população angolana que trabalhou nas plantações com muitas dificuldades e o tratamento não foi muito diferente de como os escravos também eram tratados. Então, eles forçaram a mão do angolano para, digamos, não ganhar absolutamente nada, os angolanos, mas eles, sendo colônios, que tiravam o maior benefício disto, sem dar nada em retorno, sem dar nada em retribuição.
So the proud people of the Congo Kingdom that stretched across 4 African countries, including Angola, had become reduced to mere serfs, serving the interests of their European masters. We turn to what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because the suffering of the people here at the hands of the King of the Belgians, Leopold II, has become synonymous with European savagery in Africa. It was Central Africa, in particular the vast areas around the Congo Basin, that so excited the greed and ambition of one person, King Leopold of the Belgians. In 1876, he convened an international conference of explorers and geographers at his palace in Brussels. And he invited one man, the renowned British explorer Henry Morton Stanley, to be his man in Africa. For the next 5 years, Stanley travelled up and down the waterways of the Congo Basin, setting up trading posts, striking deals and treaties with local chiefs, some of which appear to have been subsequently doctored and were put to very good use by Leopold of the Belgians. King Leopold managed to acquire vast territory in Central Africa and called it the Congo Free State. He regarded it as his own personal colony and saw himself as its proprietor, and he set about amassing a great fortune for himself. King Leopold in particular wanted rubber. The rubber trade was not dependent on large armies and centralized power as the slave trade had been. It relied on a small and mobile workforce. But King Leopold did not want to pay for labor.
Bon, lorsque l'État indépendant du Congo est constitué avec Léopold II comme souverain, Léopold II l'a conçu essentiellement également comme une affaire pour gagner le plus possible. Donc tout le monde, tous les fonctionnaires coloniaux ne sera jugé, apprécié que par leur capacité à produire du caoutchouc. Raison pour laquelle, étant entendu que le caoutchouc devient important, les fonctionnaires, mais également les compagnies concessionnaires mises en place feront tout pour que la population produise le plus de caoutchouc.
One particularly abhorrent practice was cutting off the hands of Congolese. Belgian forces had to justify the use of bullets to their superiors, so they did this by showing them the hands of locals claiming they were from the corpses of people they had shot dead.
Alors que lorsque ces gens veulent garder quelques balles pour eux-mêmes, pour leurs besoins, qu'ils puissent attraper des vivants et qu'ils puissent couper la main du vivant afin de rapporter ça et de montrer. Et donc, cela va faire que non seulement nous avons eu maintenant un amoncellement de mains coupées et boucanées, mais aussi dans les villages, voir des gens, spécialement des gamins, avec une main coupée parce que quelqu'un l'avait attrapé, avait coupé sa main pour pouvoir faire valoir et garder les balles pour soi.
This photograph, dating to around 1904, shows one father with the severed hand and foot of his murdered daughter. She was 5 years old.
Bien, on estime que de 1880 à 1930, la population congolaise a régressé. Et il y a à peu près 10 millions de personnes qui ont disparu. Et non seulement parce qu'il y a eu ces atrocités de mains coupées, mais il y a eu d'autres types d'atrocités, notamment le portage, parce que ce beau monde qui arrivait ici devait être porté à dos d'hommes, y compris leurs valises, etc., parfois même des canons pour pouvoir faire la guerre de conquête. Pendant longtemps, cette mémoire a été cachée. Parce que pendant la période coloniale, on n'en a pas parlé beaucoup. Et même actuellement.
Clearly, the horrors of Belgian rule in the Congo are still a source of pain for the people of that country. After the break, more from the Congo, as well as the carve-up of the continent by European powers in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Belgian rule of the Congo is a notorious chapter in African history. If you fly over the mineral-rich province of Katanga in DRC, you see how vast and well-endowed with natural resources it is and why the Belgians wanted to exploit it. I make my way to the regional capital, Lubumbashi, and then travel 200 kilometers north to the village of Bunkea to meet somebody who remembers Belgian rule. As part of my welcome, I'm offered a big bag of onions and a huge bowl of rice. The village is renowned for its superior rice. Kalasa Mukanda Bantu, who is nearly 100 years old, is from the Bayeki royal family of Katanga. I ask her what life was like under the Belgians.
Tata utalula bantu kubalu balabalawo imaboko nenani netupasa kuba kuponia kitine kusula misiasi nekuponia moku bapuisia kutema keba fukira no batula mane balo ankole mwanda musiri wako ubo bakupita miotoka Bamaneme luine, bamaneme batata, ne tata muine, ne bana banzi, bonto bamaneme. Bafuma pa bakalali da palo wa ng'ombe, ya tata, ka kukitoma, wa kukatata, ka benjira, kuya kuli kulwe, ka benjira. Abenjira kasiba alikulu kwibali payo bana balume iba kuteba musebo batoba wabwa.
I've traveled to Bunkea with Kalasa's niece, Dominique Munongo Inamizi, who, as well as being a member of the royal family, is an MP for the region. She's also a relative of one of the DRC's most influential politicians, Moïse Katumbi. Dominique has agreed to give me the rare privilege of visiting the hallowed site of the Royal Cemetery to tell me the story of her great-great-grandfather, King Msiri. He made a brave stand against the officials of the Belgian King Leopold II when they visited him in Katanga in 1891 and insisted he hand over his land and copper mines.
Comme ça, je vous montre les tombes de mes aïeux. Oh, il était fort respecté, hein, très respecté par les voisins. Et c'est comme ça, il était en réunion ici à son palais où nous sommes, au Munema. Munema, c'est le lieu où nous nous trouvons. Et tout d'un coup, ils ont vu arriver une cavalerie de Belges armés jusqu'aux dents. Et ils lui ont dit, nous sommes venus, tu dois nous donner cette terre. Drapeau belge ici sur vos terres. Ne dis pas question, c'est sur mes terres, vous n'avez pas le droit. À partir de là, il s'est levé, il leur a dit, allez, allez-vous-en. Parce que mon grand-père n'avait peur de rien. Hein? Il n'avait peur de rien. Alors à partir du moment où il leur a dit, allez-vous-en, Bodson a tiré sur lui, sur mon grand-père, arrière-grand-père Msiri, Gelengwa Chitambi 2, c'est ça son nom, Chitambi 1. On a tiré sur lui et c'est comme ça qu'il s'est écroulé, commencé à tituber pour rentrer dans la maison. Son fils qui était caché, Masuka. Voilà l'histoire, tous les deux sont morts le même jour. C'était une histoire assez tragique pour nous les Bayékés ce jour-là. Bon, on a perdu le contrôle.
The princess is telling me that this is the site of the original palace. And it marks the spot where King Msiri was killed by the Belgians when he refused to hand over his land and riches to them.
On a beaucoup d'émotions, comme vous le sentez, vous le voyez. C'est rare. Quand je viens ici, d'habitude, c'est toujours en larmes parce que partout où l'on passe, on nous rappelle, excusez-moi, on nous rappelle qui nous sommes, mais on doit toujours parler de cet épisode parce que ça nous aide à tenir, à aller loin dans notre vie, dans nos projets, dans nos combats, parce que j'ai toujours dit la vie est un combat. On ne peut jamais, quand on est l'arrière-petite-fille de Msiri ou l'arrière-petit-fils de Msiri, rester insensible. On doit toujours aller de l'avant, parce qu'il a été pour nous un modèle. On ne peut pas rester à ne rien faire. C'est pas possible. Nous sommes des vaillants guerriers, hommes comme femmes. Ça, je le sens. Et c'est ça. En moi, je sentais l'âme de Msiri. Ce jour-là, quand je parlais dans la campagne, je me disais, mon arrière-grand-père, tu vas pas me laisser. Christian, ça prend bien.
There is a bust of King Msiri outside the museum in Katanga, and inside there is another one of him alongside the Belgian captain Omer Bodson, who had shot him dead. Captain Bodson's last words were reportedly,
I don't mind dying now that I have killed Msiri. Thank God my death will not be in vain. I've delivered Africa from one of her most detestable tyrants.
In fact, it was the tyranny of King Leopold in Congo which was so brutal that the Belgian government was forced to demand he relinquish the territory to them. Henceforth, it was called the Belgian Congo. But the Belgians were still enthusiastic about exploiting the Congo. Africa's rich resources were a magnet for European nations, and they wanted to carve it up like one big cake between them. The Belgians were not the only Europeans who wanted to exploit Africa's vast wealth. The Industrial Revolution in Europe has sparked a growing demand for Africa's raw materials. And what better way of owning and managing these products than to control the people and territories of Africa? In November 1884 to February 1885, the Berlin Conference was convened by the Germans. Dr. Pamela Kanakwa teaches at Makerere University in Uganda.
What I would say is that Leopold's interests and activities in Congo, I think, played a very critical role or highly contributed to the subsequent scramble and eventual colonization of the rest of Africa. Of course, European activities had been taking place already before the Berlin Conference, but the fact that his actions in Congo prompted the calling of the Berlin Conference and then what the Berlin Conference does, I think makes the Congo story very central, this whole partition drama.
The Berlin Conference did not set in motion the scramble for Africa. It was more of a recognition of a process that was underway on the ground. European nations were already establishing spheres of influence in Africa, and the Berlin Conference merely formalized this and carved up the continent between major imperial powers like Britain and France. This is a tiled mural of the Berlin Conference on a memorial in Brazzaville, the capital of the Congo, to both the slave trade and the subsequent colonial domination by Europe. You can see that it's made up of tiles, and the whole arc is painted with pictures depicting scenes of that terrible era in African history. You can see there the European leaders at the Berlin Conference in 1885, their hands depicted like claws, and they have faces that are quite sort of vulture-like. And the scenes of the Africans carrying their heavy loads, trying to resist the Europeans. It really is very, very evocative and very moving. Africa was divided up between the Europeans. Only Liberia and what is today Ethiopia remained sovereign. The conquest of Africa by the Europeans was based on knowledge of what had previously and disparagingly been seen as the Dark Continent. By about 1880, thanks to the activities of their explorers, Europeans began to know far more about Africa and its interior, its terrain, resources, economy, and the strengths and weaknesses of its states and societies. And this greatly helped to facilitate the conquest of African territories by Europeans. James Nyaga is a research scientist based in Nairobi.
In many areas where we had Christian missionaries, they served as the agents of the colonialism in terms of their education, in terms of providing health facilities, and even the early education sort of exposed the Africans to colonialism. Sort of the education that they were given was very elementary. They were taught what we used to call the 3 R's, arithmetic, reading, and writing. And therefore, the African was all equipped with the tools to serve the colonial regime.
Amongst the colonial powers, French rule was one of the most extensive, particularly in West Africa. This is Grand Bassam, where the French based their headquarters when they took control of the territory known as Côte d'Ivoire. One theory that UNESCO's General History of Africa volumes really wants to put to rest is this notion, often propounded by colonial historians, that African leaders and the people did not put up any kind of resistance to the invading Europeans before, during, and after the scramble for Africa, because somehow they immediately grasped the significance of the kind of benefits that advanced European technology could bring to their societies. One overwhelming advantage the Europeans had was their firepower. This helped them defeat African communities like the Baoulé Kingdom in Côte d'Ivoire, who tried to resist French domination there. African leaders were not aware of the fact that the guns they had used and stockpiled were now no match for the superior arms used by the Europeans, Their rifles had about 10 times the rate of fire, in particular the rapid-fire Maxim gun. In the early 20th century, the French defeated the Baouli chiefs here in Côte d'Ivoire in a major revolt in the early 20th century, and they seized about 20,000 old-fashioned muskets. Once the Africans were subdued, the Europeans set about ruling them. There was a difference in approach between two major imperial powers, France and Britain.
I think that the British, in some of their colonies, quite a number of them, they used, of course, the indirect rule system, where they used the existing local authorities or indigenous systems to administer their rule. And then for the French, yes, the policy of assimilation, the idea was that there would be provision for Africans or the colonized to acquire French citizenship and be treated as Frenchmen or French women, maybe, in black skins. They sort of had to strip themselves of so many of their other cultural practices as well.
The Europeans wanted direct rule in Africa so they could exploit its resources for their own needs. They wanted cotton for their textile mills, palm oil and rubber used for tires and other industrial goods, copper, tin, cobalt and zinc and precious metals and diamonds, and also cash crops like cocoa. The main goal of the Europeans in Africa was for them to obtain the kind of raw materials that suited their needs. This is a cocoa farm north of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. And Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer of cocoa. This is a cocoa pod. Inside it are the cocoa beans from which we get our delicious chocolate. And whilst the production of cocoa here brings much needed export revenue, the vast majority of the profits of the finished product, chocolate, goes into the pockets of Western chocolate manufacturers. That was true many decades ago, and it's still true today. Another lucrative cash crop which the Europeans planted in Africa is the coffee bean. And today, this is an industry that's worth close on $100 billion globally. And again, most of the profits go overseas, not here in Africa. To grow these crops that they would use for food or consumer goods, the Europeans needed land under their control. These are the highlands of one of Africa's most fertile countries, Kenya. Europeans were given thousands of kilometers of the best farmland, the so-called White Highlands, mostly on the slopes of Mount Kenya, but also here in the Rift Valley. And Kenyans were heavily encouraged to migrate to work on these farms as laborers. Often they had little choice but to do so.
Jesus Christ. Africa, can't you open your eyes?
Outside Nairobi with her son and grandchildren, would have grown the food they needed, and their families and communities would sell the excess. But many were forced off their land. Hello, Rachel.
Hi.
Do you want to step on your plants here, your crops? Nice to see you. What do you grow here, Rachel?
We grow maize
Maize. Have you had good crops or not?
this year from April. We have not. And last year, we grew much on August. No rain.
Everything is dry.
Yeah, everything is dry. Yeah. It comes. These beans, I don't think you'll get it. But maize, if the rain comes.
I'll let you carry on with your digging. Thank you. European rule also brought with it the railway to Africa, and one of the features of colonialism that is often cited as being of benefit to the African people is the establishment of transport by train, such as in Kenya and Uganda. The railway, the steamship and the cable provided some solution to the problem of communication within Africa and also between the continent and Europe. In the late 19th century, the British began to build a rail line linking Kenya's interior with the coast. It took about 6 years to complete, and it cost the lives of hundreds of labourers. In East Africa, Uganda was initially the focus of British interests because it was strategically important for control of the River Nile. And the British agreed not to take any land for white settlers, unlike in neighbouring Kenya.
The railway was basically designed as one of the mechanisms that will facilitate the extraction of local resources for the international market and then the mother country. So it was not necessarily meant to benefit the local people. And whatever positive benefits that came out of it are more of a spin-off than something planned, in my opinion.
And it didn't link the interior of Africa with other parts of it?
Not really. It didn't link the interior of Africa with any other part. If you look at the Uganda Railway from Mombasa to Kisumu in Kenya.
So from Uganda to Kenya?
It was literally aimed at traversing the most productive areas and, of course, protecting the British interests in Uganda, which was the source of the Nile.
This is what is called the source of the White Nile in Jinja in Uganda. By the early 20th century, the domination of Africa was all but concluded. The devastating impact of European superiority in weapons and technology was a bloody and sobering experience for the Africans. But although the period of direct colonial rule is one that had a profound impact on Africa, it was relatively short-lived, lasting well under a century.
As more and more Africans got educated, quite a number of them going to study abroad. And then the influence of Pan-Africanism, we see ideas and people beginning to demand for reforms, this formation of trade unions and political parties, and people begin mobilizing. And then, of course, it's the formation of the United Nations organization after World War II. And again, that becomes a space through which problems of the colonized are raised and tabled. What then we see is, by the 60s, more and more African countries are getting their independence. Yeah.
By the early 20th century, the conquest of Africa was all but concluded. But just because it was achieved relatively quickly and easily, it doesn't mean that there was not resistance to Europeans laying down an administrative structure for colonial rule. In the next episode, we see how resistance in Africa brought their liberation. Sadly, Kalasa Mukanda Bantu died